When faced with options, and we're always faced with options, you should do that act that produces the most overall utility. Utility being something like happiness or fulfillment or some such. This is the one commandment of the moral theory known as utilitarianism. Think of the policy of raising the minimum wage. The thing to do is to add up all of the benefits, such as those that come from the poorest households barely getting by, having more income. Subtract out all of the harms, such as workers being replaced by automation, businesses closing, and younger people leaving school to go to work. Compare it with the benefits and harms of any other competing proposal. Then select the option that produces the most benefit and the least harms. This is the essence of utilitarianism. Do that action or support that policy that produces the most overall utility, where the benefits exceed the harms by the greatest amount. First question, what is this utility that's to be maximized? For the individual who's considered the founder of modern utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, writing in the early 1800s, the only good to consider is pleasure, and pain is the only thing that's bad. So to calculate the most overall utility, you add up all of the pleasures that are produced, subtract out all of the pains, and perform the action that produces the most pleasure minus pain. Bentham wrote, quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong; on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne." End quote. These early utilitarians were extremely influential reformers, particularly in England during the early 1800s. From the assumption that pleasure is intrinsically good and pain intrinsically bad, all pleasure and all pain counts equally, regardless of whose they are. From an objective point of view, if you look down on a community of 1,000 people, it doesn't matter who gets 100 units of pleasure. It is equally good no matter who gets it. Similarly, 100 units of pain is equally bad regardless of the identity of the sufferer. If there's a choice to be made between either a random person experiencing 100 units of pain or a random person experiencing 5 units of pain, the second option is clearly better. All pleasures and all pains count as equal, regardless of gender. Because of this, the utilitarian John Stuart Mill writes an essay against the subjugation of women. All pleasures and pains count as equal, regardless of race. During America's Civil War, there were some in England who argued for allying the country with the Confederacy. Mill strongly and vocally protested that idea, specifically because of the wrongness of the country allying itself with slavery. For decades before the Civil War, England actively and at its own expense used its navy to block the slave trade. A few years later, in arguing that British officials in Jamaica should be brought up on murder charges for unjust acts against blacks, Mill argued that England must be committed to, quote, "upholding the obligation of justice and humanity towards all races," end quote. All pleasures and pains count as equal, regardless of species. With regard to animal rights, Jeremy Bentham wrote, quote, "When asking whether it is morally acceptable to cause pain to someone, human or non-human, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer," end quote. And all pleasures and pains count as equal regardless of sexual orientation. With respect to homosexuality, and homosexual acts were a capital crime in England at the time, Bentham wrote in a long essay on the subject where he examined the arguments offered against it in detail, quote, "I have been tormenting myself for years to find, if possible, a sufficient ground for treating them, homosexuals, with the severity with which they are treated at this time of day in all European nations. But upon the principle of utility, I can find none which is punishable." End quote. Jeremy Bentham was also influential in the realm of prison reform. To inflict harm on others for the simple pleasure of doing so, even on criminals, is a wrong. Pain is bad regardless of whose it is. The function of prisons should not be to make people suffer, but to provide an opportunity to improve the character of individuals. Rehabilitation and reform were legitimate. Retribution and revenge were not. This list was meant to give an idea of what utilitarianism is about: increasing pleasure and decreasing pain anywhere in the world and among any being capable of experiencing it was the sole moral good. Now, John Stuart Mill, who was writing a couple of decades after Bentham, rejected Bentham's concern with simple pleasure. Mill concerned himself with happiness and the absence of unhappiness. But it's not the type of happiness one might associate with being giddy or giggling. It's the type of happiness that, well, I would imagine that a parent may feel as they hold a young child in their lap with a book and enjoy the child learning to read, or a Sunday afternoon in a park with good friends and good company. Or I recall a time early on as a graduate student when I was laying on the couch captured by a book that had my full attention. When I suddenly had this thought, I don't have time for this. I need to be studying for my class. But then I realized that the book I was reading was the assigned reading for the class. What I needed to do and what I wanted to do at that moment were in perfect agreement. For Mill, in order to experience this type of happiness, you have to be interested in things other than happiness. Reading to your child isn't something that you value as a means for experiencing happiness, it's something you value for its own sake. And you don't value your friends because you find them useful in obtaining some happiness for yourself. That's contrary to the very idea of friendship. The builder, the entertainer, the artist, insofar as they really enjoy their work, they don't pursue their craft merely as a means to something else called happiness. They, in a sense, lose themselves in what they're doing and pursue it for its own sake, not as a means to something else called happiness. Mill wrote, "It," by which he means happiness, results from the preceding considerations that there is, in reality, nothing desired except happiness. Whatever is desired otherwise than as a means to some end beyond itself, and ultimately to happiness, is desired as itself a part of happiness, and is not desired for itself until it has become so. Now, it's important to Mill's theory that these parts of happiness, these things that make up happiness, can be learned. Mill wrote, quote, "What was once desired as an instrument for the attainment of happiness has become to be desired for its own sake. In being desired for its own sake, it is, however, desired as a part of happiness. The person is made, or thinks he would be made, happy by its mere possession, and is made unhappy by failure to obtain it. The desire of it is not a different thing from the desire for happiness, any more than the love of music or the desire for health. They are included in happiness. They are some of the elements of which the desire of happiness is made up." End quote. So you begin by valuing something as a means to an end. For example, you study or you participate in sports because it will please your parents. You dress a certain way to gain the praise of your classmates, or at least to avoid the mocking and callous disapproval. But eventually, over time, that which you value as a means becomes something that you value for its own sake. Even when the benefit can no longer be found, even when you have moved out of your parents' home or graduated from school in which you were judged by your peers, the likes and dislikes learned by those experiences continue. Since happiness is the sole end, then it is better, in utilitarian terms, to learn to find happiness in whatever tends to bring happiness to others, and to learn to find unhappiness in what tends to bring unhappiness to others. So, it is better to find happiness in teaching, in helping others, in building homes and bridges, in being a producer of food or a provider of medical care, or advancing knowledge and understanding. And it is worse to find happiness in what causes misery to others, in bullying and belittling others, or when one's quest for wealth motivates one to inflict harms on others whenever one finds it profitable to do so. So then, on Mill's account, how do we get people to do the right thing? Well, according to Mill, utilitarianism has available the very same tools that any moral system has. We can attach pleasure to doing what is right and pain to doing what is wrong. There are two major ways to attach pleasure to doing what is right and pain to doing what is wrong. The first is to establish external sanctions. A very common way to attach pain to doing what is wrong is through the criminal law. We identify wrongful acts and impose criminal penalties on people who perform acts of that type. These pleasures and pains can also come from private individuals. We can offer honors and awards on the one side, and we can condemn and ostracize on the other. A second way to attach pleasure to doing what is right and pain to doing what is wrong is by creating what Mill calls internal sanctions. These sanctions are placed within people by the culture. A culture, a moral culture in the utilitarian sense, causes people to feel pride when they engage in behaviors that are beneficial to others. Heroic deeds, generous charitable contributions in public service, support of institutions and practices that help those in need. And a prudent and moral culture nurtures in its people a sense of guilt or shame when they act in ways that tend to be harmful to others, when they participate in deceptive manipulation, cause injury or death, or show a callous disregard for the harms that might come from something like drunk driving, for example. In Mill's words, quote, "The internal sanction of duty, whatever our standard of duty may be, is one and the same, a feeling in our own minds, a pain, more or less intense, attendant on the violation of duty, which in properly cultivated moral natures rises in the more serious cases into shrinking from it as an impossibility." End quote. The function of morality, then, on Mill's account, is to correctly identify which types of acts tend to produce happiness for others and those that tend to produce unhappiness for others, and then to attach external rewards and internal pleasures to the former, and external punishments and internal pains to the latter. These, then, are the fundamentals of Mill's utilitarian theory. Happiness and the freedom from unhappiness are the sole good. All happiness and unhappiness counts, regardless of gender, race, or species. Some of the sources of happiness and unhappiness are fixed, such as pain, but some can be learned. They can be acquired through experience. To promote happiness, we raise people to find happiness in that which brings happiness to others and attach internal and external pains to those who cause unhappiness to others.